Hello class, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be a narrated slide presentation for Chapter 10. Next slide. Chapter 10's title is Counterterrorism and the War on Terrorism. This particular chapter will deal with the policy options that are available to the United States government for responding to violence, in particular terrorist violence. It's important to remember when we define counterterrorism, counterterrorism is defined as proactive operations that seek to eliminate terrorist environments and groups. Our goal ultimately in counterterrorism operations is to save lives by preventing or decreasing the number of attacks. Now when you think about being proactive, I want you to think about it in a sports sense. If you're on offense on a football team, you're being proactive. You're calling your plays. You're not on defense trying to anticipate what the other person is doing. And it'll make more sense to you as we get into this chapter a little bit more. Next slide. This is more of an introductory slide where we explore our options of responses to terrorism. And again, these are policy decisions, government response to the threat. Terrorism is what is called a shadow war that uses unconventional tactics, and we've discussed that earlier in this textbook when we dealt with asymmetrical tactics, which are irregular forces, terrorists that do not wear uniforms in the traditional sense or represent a state. They blend in with the community. They use more or less hit and run tactics. These are all what we would call unconventional war tactics. The big question is, how do we combat this threat, and what are our options? And that is what this chapter is all about as we move forward. Next chapter. Excuse me, next slide. When we look at the scope of options that are available, and that's a picture of the United Nations Security Council, which makes a lot of decisions, key decisions relative to the threat from terrorism and other issues between nations. Let's look at some of the options that we have. Use of force. And when we're talking about use of force options, we're talking about, and we'll get into these in more detail as well, we're talking about actually deploying military and paramilitary groups, conducting punitive and preemptive strikes, and I will cover these in detail in a later slide. Operations other than war, and this could be covert operations or secret operations. Intelligence, gathering intelligence to try to predict what terrorist behavior is going to be and try to assist in preventing future attacks. Target hardening, this is another response that we can do, and that could be something as simple as making, including barriers around government buildings or buildings that would be key targets, fencing, the installation of cameras, the presence of armed security guards. These are all target hardening techniques that is used by government. We'll also talk a little later about economic sanctions, and these are sanctions that government can place on the government target or another government that is either supporting terrorist activity or allowing its land to be used as a base for terrorist activity, training, etc. And we also have legalistic options, and when we're talking about legalistic options, we're talking about law enforcement, etc. And the next slide is pretty. It's from a table 10.1 on page 210 of our text. And let's look at that. Next slide. In this slide, this comes from our text. Let's just take a look at some of the how to read this particular slide. Counterterrorist options, and these are the options again by government. Our counterterrorist policy classification, use of force. Rationale would be symbolic strength. So kind of like what happened when we responded to 9/11 through Operation Enduring Freedom and going after the terrorist elements and their harborers in Afghanistan and using the full force of our military and other assets. Practical objectives is to punish or destroy the terrorists, and the typical resources used in the use of force option is military assets, paramilitary assets, covert operations, these sort of things. And that could include sabotage, assassinations, kidnapping, the use of extraordinary rendition, and other techniques. Next, policy classification, operations other than war, repressive options, the rationale, what's the reasoning behind it. We want to deter. We want to deter terrorist activity. We want to be able to predict what they're doing so we can stop it. Destabilize terrorist environments. Objectives, disruption of the terrorists, development of intelligence, coercion of its supporters. Our resources are technologies, intelligence operatives, covert operatives. These are non-violent options, non-military options. Again, using intelligence to gather and predict intelligence behavior, hardening our targets, use of economic sanctions. The next line, operations other than war, conciliatory options, resolve underlying problems and the immediate crisis, use social resources, economic assets, negotiation. These would be diplomacy, addressing social reform within areas where terrorists have grievances. Another tactic that can be used is concessions, making concessions to the terrorists. As you know, the United States is not normally use that technique. We do not negotiate with terrorists, and I'm sure we're not going to start making concessions, but that is an option that's available, and some nations have used it. And lastly, legalistic options. The rationale is there's a rule of law, both domestically and internationally. It depends on, and the objectives is to develop international cooperation, prosecute, convict, and incarcerate terrorists. And our law enforcement organizations, our international organizations, etc., are involved in that. And that is essentially criminal investigation and prosecution, the development of counterterrorism laws, not only here in the United States but in other nations to counter the threat. It's a very good table on that page. Next slide. And this slide deals with counterterrorism and the use of force. Again, suppression campaigns such as Operation Enduring Freedom. These are long-term operations against terrorist cadre, their bases, and supporters through the use of military and paramilitary resources. Operation Enduring Freedom, which was the post-9/11 event after 9/11 on October of 2001. Basically, within 30 days, the United States participated in the invasion of Afghanistan to root out the terrorist elements there that had organized and managed the attack against our country on 9/11. And this involves long-term suppression campaigns using, obviously, our military resources and our paramilitary. You can, when we deal with paramilitary suppression, they talk about the case in Algeria. And in that case, in the 1990s, Algeria had a significant jihadist threat by various Islamic groups or elements within the country, and the government itself used its resources to suppress the rebellion, along with using paramilitary Home Guard units within the country to assist. And these Home Guard units were used as local defense forces, and the combination of the two responses ultimately resulted in the end of the rebellion and a negotiated amnesty settlement. So they obviously, whoever was still alive, they gave the bad guys amnesty. We also talk about punitive strikes. Punitive strikes are reprisal strikes. In other words, the terrorists do something and we react to it. One of the examples they give in the book is Operation Dorado Canyon, which happened in April 1986, where the U.S. had a terrible relationship with Libya at the time. Libya was a state sponsor of terrorism. They were closely aligned with the Eastern Bloc nations of the former Soviet Union. They allowed training camps, and they were also involved in several incidents where Americans were killed, American servicemen, etc. And so this was a reprisal attack that occurred where the United States bombed Libya in reprisal for their actions and their targeting of Americans and their support of terrorists. This would be an example of a punitive, where they did something, we responded. There's also preemptive strikes, and these are precautionary strikes to protect or degrade terrorist ability and future attacks. And this could be, for example, if we identify a high-profile target that's a terrorist, using a drone strike to kill that individual. So these would be preemptive. We're not waiting for them to do something. We're going out. We're being on the offense. Next slide. What do you think of assassination? And of course, this is something that is very debatable. We can't obviously debate it much in an online class, but it's something surely to think about. And we do have executive orders in this country that do forbid us for purposely assassinating, heads of foreign states and that sort of thing. But as you've seen in the world, in the war on terror, multiple drone strikes have been used to target terrorist leadership and units, and obviously to degrade, to destabilize, and kill those that are involved in terrorist actions and planning against our nation. What's the downside to it? Obviously, the downside to it is the terrorists themselves can use the deaths of their leaderships by labeling them as martyrs, and use that to rouse support against the West, and also to acquire new recruits. So on the pro side, we eliminate a threat. On the downside, they can use our actions against them to try to further recruit individuals to their cause. Next slide. Use of force. This is just an information slide that we're going to cover. We'll look at suppression campaigns, which we've talked about briefly. The War in the Shadows, Part 1, coercive covert operations, and the use of special operations. Next slide. There's an interesting, when we talk about coercive covert operations, we're talking about eliminating the terrorist, either through assassination, hoping that the threat will diminish if they are eliminated. Obviously, it's debatable. We mentioned that earlier. The wrath of God is a very interesting use of covert operations. It goes back to the 1972 Munich Olympic Games, where a Palestinian group called Black September kidnapped the Israeli wrestling team and set up a hostage situation, demanding the release of certain terrorists that were in their custody from from Palestinians and other groups. And the thing ended very bad, with all the wrestlers being killed. So what happened was the Israelis put together a special, how can I say it, commando team, and they went throughout Europe and tracked down everyone that was involved in that with Black September, connected them to that attack. They tracked them down and killed them, and they ended up killing about 20 people. The one downside was they did kill one innocent person. So that would be a very secret covert operation targeting a terrorist organization. And of course, we use drone strikes, as we've talked about already. We've used drones They're operated by the military and the CIA. We've used them in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen. They were used in Somalia to try to target individuals within the leadership of Al-Shabaab, the terrorist organization in Somalia, who was trying to establish closer ties between that organization and Al-Qaeda. So it would be in our interest not to have that occur. When you look at special forces, all of the major Western countries, Great Britain, France, Israel, have special force units. We have groups like the Delta Force, Navy SEALs, the Green Berets. The Marine Corps has special units as well. So these are trained, highly trained, highly skilled individuals that are involved in counter-terrorist operations. I mean, if we look at the operation that ultimately resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden, that was obviously a proactive counter-terrorist operation coordinated by the CIA and conducted by a SEAL team. But the use of special forces has become very, very important and valuable to our policy options in today's world as we deal with terrorists and we deal with irregular troops, or not troops, but irregular threats across the world. You also have special police units. The FBI has a hostage rescue team. Most federal agencies that I knew of had special teams depending on what their mission was as an agency. Local and state police have SWAT teams that are highly trained in unconventional operations. So there's a lot of focus on this element in this policy option. Next slide. We also, OOTW, other than more, repressive options, nonviolent coercive operations. We engage in infiltration, where we would try to infiltrate an organization, try to gather intelligence to help us further predict their behavior and prevent future attacks. Very difficult in the modern, especially in the new terrorism, this religious-based, predominant terrorist world environment we live in today, because it's a cell-based structure, and many of these cells are comprised of individuals that know each other very well. So you almost have to have another terrorist that you've flipped as more or less a double agent and inserted him into these groups, because without being able to do that, they're going to force whoever you try to infiltrate to try to commit a terrorist attack to prove that they're committed to the cause. So it's a real challenge. The spreading of disinformation is another option. These again are nonviolent coercive options to disrupt plans, spread damaging propaganda about the group and its members. We can also engage in cyber war, use the internet to intercept terrorist financial and personnel data, intercept their communications, intercept their plans, do whatever we can to reduce their effectiveness in doing that, through even such things as social media. But the internet is a tool for them, and is something that we have to use to our advantage as another possible option through cyber war. Next slide. This is another use of force. I shouldn't have to explain too much of this, but let me just go through one of them. It's kind of repetitive. Let's go to the last one. Counter-terrorist options, special operations forces. The rationale is coercive covert operations, destabilize the enemy, preempt any activity of the enemy, disrupt their, if we go to practical objectives, we want to disrupt the actions of the terrorist. If we arrest them, if we destroy them or whatever, it may have a deterrent effect on potential terrorists. If others see that, hey, these elite forces are identifying these individuals and either killing them or capturing them, then maybe I better think twice before I want to get involved in this. And this would be military and police assets would be our resources used. Next slide. Again, we're still in the operations other than war mode. Nonviolent covert, know the enemy. Again, the use of intelligence is very, very important. And when we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about signal intelligence, would be the interception of cell phone conversations by organizations like the NSA, interception of bank data. This is actual like interception of communications between computers, things of that nature. That would be your signal intelligence. Another one is human intelligence, and that would be information collected from human beings that are providing that information, sharing that information. But as I mentioned earlier, it's difficult in the new terrorism and the cell-based structure to actually crack into those cells, but it's not impossible. So many times if you place an informant or somebody that's going to provide information, it's probably going to be somebody that's been in that organization or somebody that can be turned to cooperate. Very challenging. Again, hardening targets, I've talked about that before, and that could be putting up barriers, electronic surveillance around key targets, fencing, things of that nature. Economic sanctions are trade restrictions that are against the government. Say, for example, today with Iran, who suspected to be developing a nuclear program, which ultimately could evolve into a nuclear war capability. So right now, for many years, there have been economic sanctions against Iran, and trying to get them to drop that, moderate their behavior, and not try to develop a nuclear plan. So that's, again, these are long-term economic sanctions or long-term policy options. They take a while for them to take effect. Normally, the government doesn't, that's being targeted doesn't suffer. It's the people that live within that country that suffer the most. One other thing I wanted to mention, when it comes to intelligence gathering, information gathering, domestically the FBI has responsibility, and on the international level, the CIA has responsibility. Next slide. Picture of the National Counterterrorism Center, which is a coordination center that all the agencies have a seat there, created after 9/11. Created to coordinate information, the sharing of information, and the development of intelligence. A very, very good concept, an organization that has a very, very important role in today's world in countering the threat from terrorism. Again, I don't want to repeat this. With intelligence, we learn about our enemy. We know our enemy. And I've already mentioned SIGINT, HUMINT, and the different agencies that are involved. Just about every agency has an intelligence capability today. It's not just the FBI and the CIA. All the federal and state and local agencies have some capability, some more than others, and some of the big cities like New York and D.C., etc. Anti-terrorism is defensive measures like target hardening. In other words, a threat is coming, and or you know there's an existing threat, and so you try to make the target harder for the terrorist to successfully attack. That is anti-terrorism, being on the defense, setting up those barriers, putting fencing in, increasing your armed security guards, etc. That's one of the challenges on the Mexican border right now, is trying to put that fencing up, try to use technology to reduce the flow of illegal immigration into the country, where obviously terrorists could also infiltrate themselves within individuals or pay somebody to smuggle them across the border to gain entrance into our nation. Next slide. Another table. Again, this one is repressive options. We have our non-violent counter-terrorist option. We have our non-violent covert operations, deter, destabilize, predict. Practical objectives, trying to again deter the terrorists, disrupt their activities. We use that through covert operations and technology. The rest of these are pretty self-explanatory. I've already talked about them. Next slide. Again, we've talked about economic sanctions. Again, they're directed against government. To be successful, cooperation must remain firm, and that's the other nations that are sanctioning. In other words, if the sanctions are that we're not going to sell certain materials to a country, if we agree not to do it, and Great Britain agrees not to do it, but the Chinese and the Russians agree to do it, it doesn't do much good. So it's important that people cooperate and remain firm, that the trade leaks are controlled, and the regime that's being sanctioned must be made to suffer or it has no effect. Again, the problem with it is usually it's the people in the country that suffer, not the regime, the leadership. And again, sometimes the coalitions are not very firm and leaks are very difficult to control. Leaks being you got a trade embargo against a country, but somebody on the side is smuggling the goods that that have been forbidden being sold to these countries across their borders or whatever. Next slide. Conciliatory options. Again, this is pretty self-explanatory. Diplomatic. You got diplomatic options where you try to resolve terrorist crisis, negotiate long-term agreements, and this has happened in history. I don't expect you're going to see that with the Islamic State or with Al-Qaeda, groups of this nature. These are fanatical individuals that, and really they're not at the state level. If we approach them from a diplomatic standpoint, do we not give them the same status? Other options are try to assist nations with social reform, to degrade those terrorist environments, and perhaps to win support from the people who are perhaps ideologically and financially supporters of these terrorist organizations. If we can do that, we can decrease their effectiveness. And typical, we target economic programs, intensive political involvement, get involved with the people. So it's a social reform focus or an option. And of course, concessions would be resolve the terrorist crisis through negotiation and try to satisfy the demands that motivate the terrorists. And that might work in some countries to a limited extent, and there have been examples of it, but are you really going to see that with the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda? Very, very doubtful. And I know the United States has a policy not to negotiate with terrorists. Next slide. Again, we have our legalistic options. International law comes into play because terrorism is it's a global phenomena, and so it's imperative that nations cooperate with each other, and the world community has to coordinate their responses. We've got international conventions that have been involved on hijacking offenses. We have the UN and other bodies have passed international laws to protect diplomats. We've established extradition treaties. If a terrorist is caught in one country, that they can release it to the country that has a warrant for that person's arrest. We've established international courts and tribunals. You have the International Court of Justice, which is the judicial arm of the UN. We've had the International Criminal Court to prosecute, for example, targets such as terrorists that are involved in genocide, etc. They had tribunals for what occurred in Yugoslavia and also the Rwandan genocide. So these are international legalistic options that are also available. Next slide. And that's just a legalistic option slide that you can read, but law enforcement, their counter-terrorist option using law enforcement and enhancement of the security apparatus. demilitarization of counterterrorist campaigns. That's let's approach this from a law enforcement perspective, not bring in the Marines, bring in the Army, bring in the Navy. Practical to day-to-day counter-terrorist operations. We bring terrorists into the criminal justice system, prosecute them, and put them in jail. And the resources are police and specialized personnel. So it's a non-military environment. Like, for example, you can't use the Navy SEALs, you can't use the Green Berets here within the domestic United States. That's a law enforcement function of the various agencies if we have terrorist cells that are operating within the country here. We also have our domestic laws that criminalize terrorist behavior, and there's also international law, international consensus and cooperation that also can degrade the impact of terrorism. And that ends the presentation for this chapter. Contact me if you have questions. End of narrated slideshow.